Thanks, Chris. So I'm happy to be able to give a summary of the AHRQ report, the effects of dietary sodium and potassium intake on chronic disease outcomes and related risk factors. So my goal today, well, first I have no disclosures. Worked for the federal government for 18 years. For my discussion, what I'd like to summarize is I'd like to go over the background and objectives of the AHRQ report and discuss the role of the DRI working group and the role of the update of the upcoming sodium and potassium work. I'm going to go over the systematic review process, all the methods, the framework, the PCOTs, the literature review parameters and methods, and finally the results of the report. So just to give a little bit of background of how we got here today, we have a joint Canada-US DRI, Dietary Reference Intake Working Group. The objective is to develop an efficient process that ensures that DRI values continue to be accurate and founded on current evidence. So we collaborate to identify DRI needs, prioritize nutrient reviews, and really work to advance the methodological issues that could impact future reviews. So it's been a great partnership over the years. So just some background on the dietary reference intake. They have a large scope of use. They promote health through nutrition monitoring. They're used in the dietary guidelines, assistance programs, health professionals use them. DRIs are used in nutrition research, food policy, nutrition labeling, and the list goes on. So this is a really important project. So the DRI working group worked to decide on which nutrients would be reviewed next and updated. So the last review was on vitamin D and calcium, and we did a nomination process and looked at all of the nutrients that were nominated, and it was decided that sodium and potassium be the next review. So that's how we got here today. So now with DRI updates, our DRI working group, a key part of the process is to fund a rigorous systematic review to inform the DRI update. So that's what I'm going to summarize today. So the purpose of the AHRQ review was to answer key questions on how dietary sodium and potassium impact health, to provide a foundation for the National Academy of Medicine review update on the sodium and potassium DRI. It was funded, the AHRQ review was funded by the Department of Health and Human Services and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And it was conducted by the Southern California Evidence-Based Practice Center, also known as RAND. So I'm just going to start off up front with the key messages that came out of the report, and then I'll go through the details. So the first key message is that decreasing dietary sodium intake significantly reduces blood pressure in normotensive adults, and especially in those with hypertension. So that's no surprise. Also, a higher risk for all-cause mortality may be associated with higher sodium intake. Also, reduced sodium intake may decrease the risk for combined CVD, mortality and morbidity. So these are the higher level messages, not the science-heavy messages that I'll go through. So next, for potassium, the use of potassium-containing salt substitutes in the diet to reduce sodium intake reduces blood pressure in adults. And also, increasing potassium intake significantly decreases blood pressure in adults with hypertension. So methods, I'll just go through these briefly. As you probably know, AHRQ has a rigorous set of methods for comparative effectiveness reviews, and their methods guide is available online. But just to go through briefly, for this review, the sponsors of the report actually scoped out the protocol in advance. So that's one option that you have as a sponsor. So we delivered a protocol to the Evidence-Based Practice Center, and they refined it. So in-house and in consultation with a technical expert panel, they refined the protocol for the research review, and they published that online. So following that, there was a literature review, which included the entire base of the 2004 sodium and potassium DRI review all the way up to 2017. So this was really key. We didn't want them to start at the end of the last DRI review because there was a lot of critical evidence in that evidence base. So they actually used all of that evidence that was in the last DRI and supplemented it with new evidence. Okay, so the rest are typical methods that you see in a systematic review. They extracted data, developed summary tables, graded the strength of evidence, drafted the report. It was put out for public review and also peer review. And following the submission of all those comments, they revised the report. Okay, so these are the key questions. There were 8 key questions. It was a very large scope. The even questions look at the effects, and the odd questions look at associations. So these are the 4 sodium questions. As you can see, the outcomes were blood pressure, and also CVD and kidney disease, morbidity and mortality, and also total mortality. So this is the analytic framework. You can see we looked at adults and children, and they looked at all of the various subgroups that would feed into the dietary reference intake. I mean, we knew a lot of these subgroup data may not be available through research, but we just wanted to make sure. So for example, if you're not able to see this, we looked at race, ethnicity, pregnancy, lactation, hypertension status, diabetes, renal status, etc. Okay, and the potassium key questions are very similar to the sodiums, but we added some kidney outcomes. For example, we added kidney stone formation and renal disease. And you'll see this analytic framework is very similar. We looked at the same subpopulations with the addition of kidney disease. Inclusion criteria in the PCOTs, they excluded cohorts with subjects with pre-existing conditions that may serve as a co-founder, so cancer, heart failure, HIV, end-stage renal disease. For interventions and exposures, they excluded anything that would serve as a major confounder, so like weight loss greater than or less than 3%. And also they excluded prospective cohort studies without baseline sodium or potassium. So for outcomes, you can see here I've already mentioned these, so I'll move on to timing. For the intervention, they had to be at least 4 weeks for blood pressure outcomes, greater than or equal to 3 months for CVD, CHD, and stroke for trials, and 12 months for cohort studies. And for renal outcomes, they had to, the studies needed to be at least 2 years. Let's see. And the study designs were mostly RCTs, clinical controlled trials, and prospective cohort studies. So risk of bias, this is critically important, and as you know, with controversy that's typically in nutrition research, the Evidence-Based Practice Center used a risk of bias for every single study. So these are some of the domains in the risk of bias. So really the goal is to look at the bias in each study. They used a Cochrane risk of bias tool for RCTs. This looks at selection bias, performance, detection, attrition, reporting, and you can find these tools online that explain every single domain. For the observational studies, they used a Newcastle Ottawa tool to look at the compatibility of cohorts and the assessment of the outcomes. Additionally, they also looked at funding source as a potential bias, potential for systematic error or random error in sodium assessment. And the sponsors and the TEP actually worked with the EPC to include even more specific questions for the risk of bias for sodium, since it's such a specific study of science. So strength of evidence, these are the domains that they looked at. Study limitations, you're probably well aware of some of these, the number of studies, study size, the overall risk of bias rating, directness, how well the outcome really represented the true outcomes, and consistency, precision, and reporting bias. and the level of strength of evidence. So they had high, moderate, low, and insufficient. So you're high, you're confident that the effect is true to the effect, moderate, and insufficient if there is no evidence or they're unable to estimate the effect. All right, getting to the exciting part, the results. So there's a lot of information, so I'm trying to do top line results. So they reviewed almost 16,000 unique citations in their initial screening, and the outcomes, it came out with 250 publications on 171 studies total for the 8 questions. Okay, so for KQ1, which was the question on sodium and blood pressure in trials, they found that sodium reduction decreases systolic and diastolic in adults. And we asked for them to look at actually the sodium level that has this impact. So it was 42 millimoles, which is about 1,000 milligrams of sodium. And it's interesting because we've seen this in other systematic reviews that 1,000 milligrams of sodium produces this effect. So for children, this was a tricky issue. There's not as many great studies in kids. It showed that there was short-term sodium reduction, didn't appear to show statistically significant results. So they did a sensitivity analysis that excluded high or unclear risk of bias studies. And they did find a difference in systolic blood pressure and significant decrease in diastolic in kids. So KQ1 continued. Sodium reduction decreases systolic in those with hypertension and those without. And I think I mentioned before that the effect is greater in those with hypertension. Evidence, so one of the sub-questions was the moderating effect of other minerals, such as potassium, calcium, and magnesium. There was low strength of evidence that potassium serves as a moderating effect, so via food or supplements. So we definitely need some more studies in that area. But they did find that potassium supplements or salt substitutes, if you substitute potassium for salt, it decreases blood pressure, which that's no surprise. So moving on to look at sodium and blood pressure, it was interesting because even from the sponsors, we were wondering if we even needed to look at cohort studies in sodium and blood pressure because there's such clear evidence in trials. But they went ahead and looked. No surprise, there's low strength of evidence. So they found sodium intake may be associated with systolic blood pressure. And the reason that it was low strength of evidence is that a lot of the studies are high risk of bias. So I think that's something that is really useful that came out of this report, is that the EPC really looked at each individual study and looked at the limitations. So I think that's useful to the field. So the third question, sodium and CVD trials and also cohorts. Go ahead. So they found that in adults, evidence was insufficient to draw a conclusion regarding the effect of sodium reduction on the risk for all-cause mortality or CVD mortality alone. They did find low-level evidence on sodium reduction may significantly decrease the risk for combined CVD mortality and morbidity. Additionally, the evidence from a small number of RCTs doesn't support the effect of sodium reduction for stroke. And finally, sodium reduction may significantly decrease the risk for composite measure of any CVD outcomes. So one of the interesting things from this report, the way that RAND conducted their methods, is that they included like every single study that was that met the criteria, and even if there were like some good studies that had results, it was fairly consistent. If there were a lot of studies that did not have consistent results, that kind of brought down the level of evidence. So they actually reported on that at the DRI working group meeting, and we found that very interesting. So for example, sodium and blood pressure, we were all just kind of like struck at how that level of evidence wasn't high, because it's fairly clear. But then we found out that the way they do it is they take in everything. So even like the not as well done studies can bring down the level of evidence. So that's just a note on the side. but they stated that in a public meeting, so I thought it was worth repeating. So the fourth question, sodium in CVD cohort studies, they found that higher sodium intake appear to be associated with high risk for all-cause mortality. And additionally, evidence is insufficient to assess the association of sodium in risk for CVD, CHD, and stroke. So moving on to potassium, they found that increased potassium intake from supplements reduces blood pressure in adults. And this is, again, the substitution of potassium salt for sodium. I'm going to have to move on. Let's see here. See if there's anything I haven't said. So they found that evidence is insufficient to support a conclusion on the effect of potassium in kidney stone formation. So that's from the trials. But I added in the cohort from the sixth question here because the cohort studies found that higher potassium appears to be associated with lower risk for kidney stones. So as you can see, the trials and the cohorts don't always agree with themselves. So moving on to question 7, they found insufficient evidence on the effect of potassium supplementation and all-cause mortality and all of the CVD morbidity, mortality, and renal morbidity and mortality. And insufficient evidence for the association of potassium and long-term chronic diseases. So overall conclusions, the takeaway, reducing sodium intake, increasing potassium intake, and the use of potassium containing salt substitutes in the diet significantly decrease blood pressure, particularly those that have hypertension. Also, there's limited evidence that suggests that sodium intake is associated with risk for all-cause mortality, and that reducing sodium intake may decrease the risk for CVD, morbidity, and mortality. Thank you.